So what's going on, Dan?
And I'm just living. You ready to build a bar?
I am. Let's do it. All right, man. So this is our inaugural episode, if that's a word, if that's a real word, inaugural. I think
It is now.
yeah. So it's our inaugural episode of building a bar. And I want to kind of give a little bit of background information as far as why I want to do this. And maybe if you want to chime in a little bit too, feel free. But when I first got into bourbon, um, it was hard for me to follow kind of what trends, what I wanted to look for, what kind of bottles I wanted, because you right off the bat, when you get into the bourbon influencer type, you start following bourbon influencers, you'll immediately start getting into these people that if it's not Blanton's or it's not Pappy or it's not a $500 bottle, then it's not worth drinking. It's not worth having. And so I thought, what would be kind of cool is to do a podcast or a video podcast where we literally build a bar. So if someone's new to bourbon, or heck, maybe they've been into bourbon for a long time, but maybe just want to learn a little bit about, some bottles, or learn about, some history behind it. Though, so, this would be kind of a show that we could do that. So what I'm wanting to do is each episode we're going to alternate. So I'll start tonight, then next week will be your show. We're literally going to build a bar bottle by bottle. And so what I've asked us to do is each week we bring a bottle to the table and do a little research on it. Let's talk about, why this bottle needs to be on a bar, why this bottle should be a part of, everybody's home bar. And let's give a little information about it. So does that sound cool to you?
I think that's a great idea. I think one of the coolest things about it, well, for the ones that have been into bourbon for a while, or anything for that matter, Scotch, whatever, we kind of get carried away with the traditionalism of, if it ain't Jim Beam or Jack Daniels, but one of the things that I love that I think would bring to the table tremendously would be the fact that not only these bourbons or whiskeys or scotches or whatever we decide to help build, not only do we kind of give them the taste profile and everything like that, but behind every label there's a story behind it. It's a whole story in a bottle. And
Right.
So to build these bars, you're not only building your taste profile to match what you like or what other people may like, but there's a little piece of history in every bottle that I think is super cool.
Yeah, man. So that'll be kind of the setup. Each week we'll have a different bottle, and whoever brings that bottle will tell why we brought it. The other one has a list of questions that we'll kind of ask that kind of talks about, what to expect out of this bottle, things like that. So I tell you what, why don't we go ahead and jump in? So I'll start. So the bottle that I want to 100% start with, this probably, if you know me, will be no surprise. The bottle that I want to start with is the Evan Williams Bottled and Bond White Label Bourbon. Mainly the reason I want to start with that is people ask me quite often, what's your favorite bottle of bourbon? And I would say, I'm not so sure it's my favorite bottle of bourbon, but if I can only drink one bottle of bourbon the rest of my life, I would pick this bottle because it's so versatile. It's like this bottle, I mean, you can drink it straight. I drink most of my bourbon, I drink neat. You can drink it neat. You can put a couple of cubes in there. It's perfect for cocktails. I mean, it's just an all around I do say this all the time when people ask me what's a good all around bourbon, or when people ask me for recommendations, I want to buy so-and-so a bottle of bourbon. That's the one I recommend the most. And so for that reason, this should be the first bottle that is on your home bar.
I'll drink to that.
I'll drink to that. So what questions you got for me?
I got a bunch of them.
Right.
I do kind of want to forewarn you here. These questions I have, I am what's known as a dog legger.
What the hell is this?
And so
A
these
dog
questions,
liquor? A dog liquor?
so okay, I'm known by two things: dog liquor and dog legger.
Oh, okay.
I also love to leg dogs. That's a pastime of mine.
I knew that. So
these questions that I ask are probably going to spur other questions, and so bear with me.
okay.
But the first question that I have for you specifically about Evan Williams Bottle and Bond, which is also one of my favorites, why should this bottle be on anyone's bar? Like, why? What's specific about this? Why should this be on there?
Well, like I said earlier, I think this is going to be for those who are just getting into bourbon, and for my friends that have been into bourbon way longer than I have. This is probably going to be one of your go-to bottles. So, like I said, whenever I have friends over, often since I moved to Kentucky 2 years ago, when I have friends come up and visit, and they want to try different things, still, even though you can pretty much get this anywhere, I mean, you can get this at any liquor store in Arkansas or Tennessee or Kentucky or California, wherever you go, this is pretty easy to find. But I always throw that in because it's such a great bottle. And I think if you're like me, you will find that is the bottle that you're going to go to the most when you have guests over and they want a Manhattan or they want a old fashioned. If you're not using rye for that, you're going to go to that bottle. And for most bourbon cocktails or whiskey cocktails, I think this holds up probably the best. And like I said, it's just a versatile drink. So I think this is going to be one of your go-to. And I'll tell you, for my bar, I don't ever go without this. So, there are bottles that I'll have on my bar at some points, and sometimes I won't, because when I go without it, when I man down, as people say, when I drink it all, sometimes I'll refill it, sometimes I won't. This one, I always go. If I'm out of Evan Williams Bottled and Bond, I go to the store the next day and get it.
Give it time. Somebody were to visit your house, your place, this is there.
100% going to be there all the time.
Okay, this has spurred me to a different question, but I do have to ask this because for people, not the ones that have been in the bourbon thing for a while, but the newer folks, when we say terms like bottled and bond, what exactly does bottled and bond, what does that mean?
So I'll make this quick, and I think this would be a good episode. This would be a good term for us to do an episode on for new folks. But basically, bottled and bond it's a set of regulations that are put on. It's not just bourbon. I mean, you can have bottled and bond gin. You could have bottled and bond, brandy. You could have bottled and bond. My buddy Royce Neely up the road, he's coming out with a bottled and bond moonshine. So, I mean, it's not specific to bourbon. However, bourbon was the first to use this. And basically, it's just a strict set of guidelines. So if you think of like when bourbon became a thing, what set that in motion was whiskey was just all over the place, and there were no rules and regulations, no guidance. So, somebody sat down and said, okay, we're going to make a category out of this. So in order for it to be bourbon, it's got to be 51% corn. It's got to be, made in America. It's got to be, aged in oak containers. So there was a set of guidelines. Well, even within that, people were, these rectifiers is what they called them or whatever, they were kind of going crazy with adding tobacco spit and adding whatever. So basically the government stepped in and said, we're gonna create a set of guidelines that has to fit in order for it to be bottled and bond. And basically, from what I understand, and I think this is right, it was the absolute first time the government made any kind of rules and regulations on edible goods. So, in the food and drink regulation, it was the first regulatory set of rules was the bottle and bond. And so you can look it up, and research it. I think a good episode for us to do later on would be kind of what's bottled and bond so So that,
So before I move to the next question, I never thought I would say this in my entire life. The government's good for something, right?
one thing.
One thing and one thing only. They're
One
good
thing.
for bond, and that's it.
Yeah.
Not just the bottled and bond, but this Evan Williams bottled and bond, I guess. Who made this?
So it's made by Heaven Hill. So if you don't know a lot about, if you're kind of new or whatever, you don't know a whole lot about Heaven Hill, look them up. So it's an interesting company. They're the largest independently or family owned bourbon distillery in the world. So they're still family owned, they're still family driven. And so I want to say, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think at one time, as far as bourbon is concerned, not necessarily whiskey or distilled products, but I think bourbon, I think they're the second largest producer of bourbon behind Jim Beam. I think that's accurate. I might be wrong. And surely for those that are way more into the bourbon stats and facts, call me out on it. Their main headquarters is based right in Bardstown. And so they actually have an Evan Williams experience in Louisville. And next time you're in town, you and I are going to this Evan Williams experience because it's pretty amazing. So not only is it one of my favorite bottles, but that's probably my favorite tour and experience bourbon related in the state of Kentucky.
It's an experience, right? Rather than a tour.
Yeah, for sure.
I think cool. So with this specific bottle, what is the recipe or mash bill, as we would say in the bourbon community? What is the mash bill for this bottle, this specific bottle?
So what's interesting about this recipe is there's nothing interesting about it. So it's like a kind of middle of the road, 78% corn, 10% rye, 12% malt. And so there's nothing really, it's not really like a high rye. It's definitely not a wheated bourbon. So it's just kind of middle of the road, but it stands up, so well. We'll get to this a little bit later, but like the tasting notes on this and everything, it's pretty, it has a lot of complexity for it being kind of just a middle of the road recipe, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things that this isn't a question. This is just one of my dog-legging moments here. I've always wondered how people can take middle of the road things and make them great. I mean, as we'll get to, there are so many. When you look at the bourbon world, the bourbon community, the whiskey community, you got your Tennessee whiskeys, you got your bourbons, you got your whiskeys without the E, your scotches, the whole thing. The mash bills are very close, right? Mm-hmm. Very close. But what that profile does, this specifically, the smell, and I'll let you get to this later, but the smell and the taste, even though it's so close to everything else, but one of the things that I think is phenomenal about fermentation in general is that I think that whenever you can take the exact same mash bill, the exact same temperature, same everything, and it's going to be a different product each time. And you're going to get different. And I just think that that's cool. So no, I agree with you though, even though this is like a middle of the road mash bill or a middle of the road, they did a very fine job with it.
Well, let me before you go, I want to point out something real quick. I think it's pretty cool. When I first got into bourbon, and I met a guy named Steve Akeley, and he and I do bourbon films together, and but through him I met this Royce Neely. So you and Royce are good buddies, and
yeah.
So one of the things that he and I were talking about one day, and I thought was super interesting, he was telling me, if he said if I took the same mash bill and I ran it here, and I gave that same mash bill to Heaven Hill down in Bardstown, and then I gave it to Jim Beam, and I gave it to Four Roses, and I gave it, no matter, it could be the same exact recipe, but made in different parts of Kentucky. And he said you would get, for every person that ran that mash bill, you would get different flavors of spirit because, it has everything to do with the one of the words I've learned since I've kind of moved up here is the terroir, which is all the elements. So it has everything to do with not just the grain that goes in there and not just where you run it, but it's got everything to do with the air around you, the water, everything that's around you. And so it's going to run different up here where I am in Sparta, which is where, Neely Family Distillery is. It's going to run different there than it does down in Bardstown for Heaven Hill or over where Jim Beam is. So the interesting thing is you can have the same exact mash bill and run it 4 different times and you're going to get 4 different products out of it. So
Dude,
to
I
me,
think cool.
yeah. I mean, how cool is that? So didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. So with that being said, tell me a little bit about the label, and I'm not talking about like the design of it. I'm talking about like the name. Like, did Evan Williams run that? I mean, is this an Evan Williams thing?
So, what I'm going to do, I am actually going to, I'll give you a little bit, but I'm going to save some information. So I've told you a good bit about the distillery. I'm going to save a little bit of information simply because there's many different expressions of the Evan Williams product line. And so I'm sure later on down the road, we're going to have more on here. So, but I do want to say it is named after Evan Williams, who was a distiller. He was a wharf master in Louisville. So he was a very influential person in the history of, Kentucky history, Louisville history, bourbon history. And so that's why it's named after him. And we'll get more into his name and kind of what all he did at a probably a later episode, because like I said, there are many, many other expressions of the Evan Williams product line.
Okay. Well, speaking of expressions, what other expressions are there?
Okay, so
3.
Well, so you have which is probably my favorite is the white label, and this is a the bottled and bond, like we talked about earlier, has a lot of restrictions to it. So it's been restricted to be a more high end product, but it's basically the bottled and bond is a direct offshoot of their black label, which is a 86 proof, just generic Evan Williams. So it would be equivalent to the Jim Beam white label or the, Four Roses yellow label. So, I mean, that's their kind of run of the mill bourbon. They have a small batch offering, which is 1783. So it's Evan Williams 1783. That's their small batch. And so, small batch in the bourbon industry doesn't really mean anything because, a small batch for a craft distillery might be 3 barrels, but small batch for Heaven Hill or Jim Beam might be 300 barrels. Yeah. So it, take that for what it's worth, but 1783 is a pretty good brand. They also have a single barrel, they call it single barrel Evan Williams vintage. And so it's, like I said, that's probably one of my favorites too. And I've never had one of those single barrels that I didn't like. And then they even have a rare unicorn bottle, and we will be talking about this in a later episode because I actually have a bottle of it, but it's the Evan Williams.
Unicorn bottle?
Yeah, so unicorn just meaning like hard to find. So what that is the Evan Williams 101 proof. It's a red label, and what makes it kind of rare and unique is you can only find it in 2 places in the world. You can either find it at the distillery, and if I'm not mistaken, you can only find it at the Evan Williams Experience in Louisville, downtown Louisville, or you can find it in Japan. And so when we get to that episode, we'll talk about like why you can only find it in those 2 places. But yeah, I mean, so you can see that they put a lot of stock into the Evan Williams brand, the Evan Williams name. And so, they do have expressions that kind of cover all the bases from your basic bourbon drinker to, your single barrel snobs or your, whatever. So they have it covered.
I think I remember reading about that. So I'm interested in getting to that one about the red label. So for the bottled and bond, what do you think would be an average or a fair price? What would somebody expect to pay for this bottle?
So what I use, and if you're new to bourbon or you're new to spirits, I would encourage you to download the Booze app. They're not sponsored. They haven't sponsored us or anything like that. I use Booze app. And so basically what they do is they'll take a bottle like this and they'll tell you what the average MSRP price is and then what a fair price is. And so the average MSRP for this bottle is $16.75, but the average kind of a fair price for it is around $24, $25. And so I know in Kentucky right now, I can get this bottle for about $18. So yeah, this would be a great bottle to start with, to add to your, to start your bar with. It's not going to break the bank. And as most of everything we're going to talk about over the next couple of weeks and months, they're going to be bourbons that aren't going to break the bank. That's the whole point of this podcast or this video cast, is to show that there are bottles out there. You can pay $18-$20 for this bottle and be satisfied that you're getting a good product. And it doesn't have to be a $500 bottle, or it doesn't have to be $1,000 bottle. There are just as good bottles for $18, $20, $30, whatever.
Okay, so how hard would this specific bottle be to find? I know that earlier you mentioned whether you're in Arkansas or Kentucky or California or wherever.
Yeah, since this is pretty much, this isn't like the flagship, like we talked about the Black Label being the flagship, but because it is kind of, one of the main products in the Evan Williams line, it's easy to find. I mean, you should be able to go out to any liquor store and they should have it on their shelf. So, like I said, whether you're in, California, North Dakota, Arkansas, wherever, you should be able to go to the liquor store and find that for relatively cheap.
Okay. All right. Out of all the questions that I've asked you, okay,
All right.
I want to get down to the nitty gritty. I want to get down to the good stuff. I want to do this with you, live vicariously through you.
Yeah.
What should the average drinker taste in this? So if I'm brand new to this and I've taken your advice, I get this bottle, we're at the bar, I pour it up. What am I looking for? What am I trying to, what are the profiles of taste?
Okay. So assuming you're at the point in your bourbon journey or your whiskey journey where you don't just taste campfire wood, because that's where I was for a long time. Before I really got into bourbon, I would drink it or shoot it and be like, depends on what type of wood it tastes like, but it tastes like wood. Once you kind of get past that and you're really, kind of taking your bourbon collecting and drinking seriously, that's what I was saying earlier about this bottle. It's cheap and it's a middle of the road kind of mash bill, but it's a very full, very sweet, and it's got a ton of complexity. So, and again, this whole podcast, this video cast, whatever we're going to call it, this isn't simply to sit there and say, here's what we're drinking and here's what you should be tasting. And, we're experts on this, because that in fact is not true. So, but I do want to kind of end each episode with a little bit of like what you should be. And so for me, whenever I nose this, I mean, it's immediately hits me with sweetness, kind of like baking spices. And I know people say all the time, like, oh, it's got vanilla and caramel in it. But to me, it's a little bit deeper than that. It's more of like
a nutmeg type of.
Yeah, more of those kind of baking spices. And so, when I taste it, that's what I immediately get. I get that. But then on the back palate, because it is 100 proof. So if you're used to drinking 80 proof or 86 proof or 90 proof, even, you kick off with 100 proof and you're not used to it, it does have a kick to it. So on the back end, I get like a spice kick, like a peppery, kind of kick to it. Not too much, but it's enough that it rounds out the sweetness. And it's not, it's not so much of a sweet bourbon that I would classify that as a dessert bourbon. So, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about bourbons that are like dessert bourbons or whatever. So we are going to be talking about that. So, but this one, the peppery, it's enough to kind of round out that sweetness and give it like an overall kind of even flavor. If that makes sense.
Well, that does make sense. I do want to reiterate that, again, you and I are not the experts. You and I are just a bunch of dummies born and raised in Mississippi and have a love for this stuff. And these are things that we love to do. These are things that we taste. And, I remember as a teenager that you go out and you get a bottle of Jack or you get a bottle of, whatever at the time, because whiskey's come a long way. Bourbon has come a long way in the past 20 years, 30 years, And so going from what it used to be, you get a bottle of Jack Daniels and you shoot it down so you can get drunk. Well, when you get a little bit older, you don't recover from that as well. So you kind of want to sip it. You want to taste the art that's in it. And so this is a culinary experience. And so whenever you're tasting these things, you're looking for the cherry taste, the currant taste, the chocolates, the leathers, I've even had some that taste like tobacco. So these are not things that you will taste. These are just things to look out for. These are, I enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you think we did a good job? So
absolutely. You know what?
For our first bottle to go on the bar, you approve?
I absolutely approve. Check mark.
Okay. Good. All right, homie. Well, I'll see you next week then, I guess.
Same bad time, same bad channel.
All right. All right, man.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. If you like what you heard, check us out on these social media platforms. Just search for My Journey Through the American Spirits.